I'm Pam Hurd, and I'm currently the co-principal investigator on the study. So that's sort of, I guess, academic speak for I'm the one responsible now, or primarily responsible when there are problems. This is my problem now. And the sample is generated from 1 out of 3 Wisconsin high school graduates from the class of 1957. So the gist is the UW system, University of Wisconsin system, in the late 50s surveyed all of the high schools in Wisconsin, trying to get a sense of what the demand would be like and then what to do about an influx in demand for higher education. And Bill Sewell, sociologist at Wisconsin, basically found these surveys in a basement on campus 5 or 6 years later, and then hence the study. Bob Hauser, who's also a sociologist at Wisconsin, who is still PI or co-PI in the study, has basically run it for about 30 years now. So it's almost a family study in some ways. So it's 1 out of 3 Wisconsin high school graduates. We think of our respondents as the Happy Day cohort. And so Fonzie is not a part of it, right? He was a high school dropout. Of the remaining 3, we picked 1 randomly. So the original sample size was just over 10,000. The sample has changed quite a bit over time, though. So starting in the mid-1970s, so there was the original survey in 57, a follow-up in the early 60s, and then by the mid-70s, they also started sampling siblings. And so, frankly, for the bulk of the survey length, it's been a sample really of siblings, the graduate, and then 1 selected sibling. But we have a lot of data on parents, on the children of our graduates and siblings, and also in 2004, we interviewed the spouses of the graduates. So we think of it increasingly as a family data set. So just briefly here, these are the survey years. 57, 64, 75, 77 was the first attempt to interview siblings. 92, 94, 2004, 2006, and 2010 were in the field. Basically from the 70s onwards, you were looking mostly at telephone and mail surveys, but for the first time in 2010, we're actually going into people's homes. And that allows us to do a lot more than we've been able to do over the phone. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the unique things we're able to do by going into people's houses. Okay, but we're here thinking about, financial literacy. So the way that I thought to do it was to first just give you a sense, basically, about what sort of outcome measures would be relevant if you're thinking in our survey, if you're interested in financial literacy. So from 1957, we have background in terms of parents' occupations, their educational attainment, and their income. So very detailed occupational data. The income data is actually based on tax records, so it's administrative data, and then parental educational attainment. Between 1975 and 2010, we've been collecting data on earnings of the primary respondents as well as their spouses, so sort of household earnings. Since 1992, we've been collecting full data, total income data, both at the household and individual level. Full asset data since 1992, and really detailed asset data. Intertransfers, so transfers within families, for example. Financial transfers within families, but since 1992, we've been accounting for that. And then in 2010, we started introducing basically a few different things I think that are kind of interesting. So the first is a financial literacy measure. So this is a knowledge measure. It's the kind of thing where you ask people, you make these sort of statements about, say, you describe what compound interest is, and then you say how true or untrue is this statement. So it gives you a sense about people's financial knowledge. And then we also have people playing economic games. Basically, you get a sense of people's risk preference when it comes to finances. And some of those are quote-unquote real stakes. So our respondents fill out the survey, but then they may get a check later if they win what they gambled. And the panel this morning, I also talked about there's ways to use some of our existing measures to get at sort of knowledge and behavior. So for example, all of our financial questions, or nearly all of them, there's an option for people to not just refuse, they can just say, I don't want to answer that, but they can also say that they don't know the answer to the question. And so I've been playing with that quite a bit, and I've been doing more and more sensitivity testing on it, and I'm finding it's actually a pretty good, or it seems to be a pretty reasonable way to get at some sense of an individual's financial literacy. And the other advantage to that is other surveys like HRS, for example, also will ask their income questions like that. So it's something that we may be able to utilize in a lot of different surveys that haven't asked really the kinds of explicit financial literacy questions that people are starting to introduce now in some surveys, but still may get at some similar, at least, underlying concepts. And then Social Security records. So we are just now collecting from our respondents permission to merge their Social Security administrative records with our data. Now there's tons of privacy protections on this, and you're incredibly careful about how you do this and who gets to, the restrictions on people who use the data, basically. But this should provide us with a lot of really interesting information, ultimately. Now I'm just going to give you a sense about general domains. So, right, you've got your outcome, but there's a lot in the survey that might be interesting in terms of thinking about what predicts financial literacy and financial well-being outcomes. So we have incredible education data starting from the early 1950s, including lots of details about their high school experience from when they were in high school. That's prospective measurement. We're not asking people in retrospect. We have administrative data on their high school IQ scores. And then we also actually have school administrative data on there from elementary school on the kinds of resources that were available to those schools financially. We have a wealth of employment data, employment aspirations, jobs and jobs characteristics, earnings. In fact, from the sort of mid-1970s, I'd say into the early 90s, that's what primarily a lot of people were using these data for, was for educational attainment and occupational attainment. Now the survey is sort of, because our respondents are getting older, it's shifted more towards things that are mattering to people in mid to late life. In the social domains, we have everything from codings on people's high school yearbooks. So we got their high school yearbooks and then did codings such as attractiveness, which actually does matter, at least for men, in terms of their earnings. The kinds of school activities they participated in, the kinds of involvement. Since the mid-1970s, we've been asking the same questions about people's involvements in all kinds of organizations, social and family dynamics in terms of relationship quality, and religious affiliation and participation and caregiving. So some of these domains, I think, particularly caregiving and the family and friend data, I think may ultimately matter because oftentimes, right, we make financial decisions in collaboration with other people. And our data can really get at that, basically, in many different respects. More family data, parental background, full marital histories, the amount of time that people spend with their family, and then also a lot of detailed information on children. One thing that's really special about this study in terms of thinking about disability, and I know this is an interest for the Social Security Administration, is that we have actually, our respondents, we selected out basically, or were able to figure out our respondents who had children who either had developmental disabilities or significant forms of mental illness. And basically, we've started interviewing those families with additional kind of interview supplements in 2004 and are continuing to do that. And we're looking at interviewing the siblings of the children who have a developmental disability or a significant mental illness. So for these sorts of groups, if we're interested in vulnerable groups in terms of financial planning and financial skills, both groups matter, both the people who are caregiving for these individuals and have to think about long-term financial planning and the kinds of financial drains that people face when they have children, for example, with a developmental disability, but then also the individuals themselves, the children themselves. That's that sample. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the extensiveness of our cognition measures. So I think we're pretty much the only survey that has been tracking cognition for this long, basically. So we have that, because we have that measure from 1957, we can always account for what people's cognition was like, I think, which is pretty much at your peak when you're late adolescence, pretty much. And then starting in 92, they started collecting more up-to-date cognitive measures on individuals. have continued to do that between 1992 and now in the field. We're actually doing things that are a little bit more innovative on the cognition side. So rather than just asking people to sort of recall numbers, like you give them a range of different numbers and then they have to spit back those numbers to you or things like that, we actually are putting computer instruments in front of them and having them do all these sort of different tests to get at more kind of subtle cognitive change that will happen as our respondents age. And I think this is going to be really important in terms of when we're looking at older people and kind of understanding issues about financial literacy for older people and consequences, thinking about the relationship between cognition. If 1 in 5 older people have diminished cognitive functioning, that's going to have outcomes for their ability to manage their financial lives, and we'll have a better sense of that. And the final sort of thing that we're doing on the health side, which I don't know how, in terms of thinking about behavioral outcomes like financial literacy, I think there's a lot of interest in this. I'm not sure that we know what to do with it yet. But we are collecting now genetic data on our participants as well. So over the long term, I think that has more obvious implications for health outcomes. And the behavioral outcomes are a lot more controversial, I think, in terms of linking that with genetic associations. But that's the gist. Thank you very much.